Maggie's fingers had gone white around that letter by the third morning. She hadn't eaten. She hadn't slept. She just sat on those post office steps with her one small trunk beside her, and waited because waiting was the only thing she had left to believe in. When the sheriff finally walked up and told her she was becoming a problem, she didn't cry. She didn't beg. She looked him dead in the eye and said, "I ain't leaving." That was the moment Jack Holt stopped walking. That was the moment everything changed. If this story moves you, please subscribe to our channel and follow Maggie's journey all the way to the end. Drop a comment and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story travels. The letter was dated April 14th, 1874. Maggie had read it so many times the paper had gone soft at the folds, the ink smearing in two places where her thumb had pressed too long too hard, too many nights alone in the boarding house back in Missouri. She didn't need to read it anymore. She had it memorized, every word, every comma, every careful, deliberate sentence that a man named Harold Greer had written to her through the Frontier Matrimonial Agency out of Kansas City. I am a man of modest means, but honest character. I own 40 acres outside Harlan Creek, Wyoming territory. I am looking for a woman of good temperament who is not afraid of hard work. If you are willing, I will send for your passage. I will meet you at the Harlan Creek Post Office on the 15th of June. You will know me by my brown hat and my good intentions. Good intentions. Maggie almost laughed out loud when she thought about that line now. But she didn't laugh. She hadn't laughed since she stepped off that stagecoach 4 days ago and stood in the June heat of Harlan Creek, Wyoming, looking up and down the main street for a man in a brown hat. There hadn't been one. There wasn't one on the second day either. Or the third. She had gone inside the post office on that first afternoon and asked the postmaster, a thin, slope-shouldered man named Elias Pruitt, whether anyone had come in asking about a mail-order arrangement. Pruitt had looked at her over his spectacles with the slow measuring gaze of a man deciding exactly how much pity to give a stranger. "Can't say anyone has miss," he'd said. "You got a name for the fellow? Harold Greer." Pruitt had tilted his head and pulled at the skin under his chin. "Can't say I know that name either. You sure you got the right town?" "Harlan Creek, Wyoming territory," Maggie had said, and her voice had been steady because she'd made herself keep it steady. "I'm sure." "Well," Pruitt had gone back to sorting his envelopes. "If he shows up, I'll send him your direction." She'd said thank you and walked back outside. She'd sat down on the top step of the post office porch. She'd put her trunk beside her, and she'd waited. By the third morning, Harlan Creek had formed an opinion about her. She heard it in the way women crossed to the other side of the street when they passed. She heard it in the low comments that floated out of the general store doorway when she walked by to refill her water canteen. She heard it most clearly from a woman named Dorothy Hicks, who ran the town's only dress shop and had apparently decided that Maggie's situation was her personal business. "She's still out there," Maggie heard Dorothy say to someone on the boardwalk that morning, pitched loud enough to carry. 3 days on those steps, no husband, no arrangement, nothing. You ask me, she's either a fool or something worse. The woman Dorothy was talking to had glanced over. Maggie had met her eyes and held them until the woman looked away. That was the only weapon she had left, her stillness. Her refusal to flinch. But underneath that stillness, Maggie was breaking. She was 29 years old. She had left behind a sister in St. Joseph who hadn't tried very hard to talk her out of leaving. She had left behind a job stitching buttonholes in a textile factory for 60 cents a day. She had left behind 4 years of saving money in a glass jar under her floorboards so she could afford the agency fee and the stage fare and a new pair of boots that wouldn't embarrass her when she met the man who'd promised he'd be there. She had left behind everything. And Harold Greer had left behind nothing because he'd never shown up in the first place. Sheriff Dale Mosher came for her on the third morning. He was a wide man with a deputy's eagerness still stuck in his movements even after 12 years wearing the badge. He came up the steps with his thumbs hooked in his belt and stopped in front of her with the look of a man who'd rehearsed what he was going to say. "Morning, miss," he said. "Morning, Sheriff. You've been sitting out here a fair number of days." He rocked on his heels, starting to make people a little uneasy. Maggie looked up at him. The sun was already brutal at 8 in the morning, pressing down on the top of her head like a flat iron. "I'm not doing anything unlawful, Sheriff." "No, you ain't," he allowed. "But you ain't got a room rented either. No kin in town. No husband come to collect you." He paused, giving her the chance to fill in the silence. She didn't. "Now we got a stage going back east on Friday. I could arrange—" "I ain't leaving," Maggie said. Mosher blinked. "Miss, I came here because a man sent for me," she said. "I am going to wait until that man presents himself, or until I know for a fact that he isn't coming. Either way, that's my business, and not yours. Sheriff, with all respect." Mosher's jaw tightened. He wasn't used to that kind of answer from a woman sitting on the ground with a worn-out trunk and 3 days of summer heat on her face. He opened his mouth to respond. "She said she ain't leaving Mosher." The voice came from the street below. Both of them turned. A man stood at the base of the post office steps. He was tall, not in an imposing, theatrical way, but in the way that some men are simply built large, like something the land itself had assembled. He had dark hair gone a little gray at the temples, and a jaw that looked like it had been set in concrete sometime around his 30th year and hadn't shifted since. His hat was dusty, his work shirt was dusty, and the look on his face said that he had not come over here to make friends with the sheriff. Maggie had seen him before. He'd passed by twice the previous day, each time on a horse loaded down with feed sacks, each time not stopping, but slowing slightly as he went by the post office steps. She hadn't thought much of it. Men stared at her. Men had always stared at her. It meant nothing. But he wasn't staring now. He was looking at the sheriff with the flat, patient look of a man who had already decided how this conversation was going to end. "Jack," Mosher said, and his tone shifted slightly. Careful now the way men got careful with someone they respected or feared or both. "This ain't your concern." "I know it ain't," the man Jack said. "I'm just pointing out that the lady stated her position clearly, and I don't see any lawful reason for you to push her on it." "I'm not pushing anyone." "You were about to." Jack looked at Maggie then for the first time directly. His eyes were the color of creek water after rain, not quite gray, not quite green. "Ma'am, has this man given you any trouble?" Maggie felt something strange move through her. Not relief exactly, something more like recognition. The shock of someone treating her like she had, standing like her words from a moment ago had been worth backing up. "No," she said. "He hasn't. We were just talking." Jack nodded once, then looked back at the sheriff. "There you go." Mosher's face had gone a particular shade of red that suggested he was doing calculations about dignity. He straightened his belt and cleared his throat. "I'm just trying to look out for the town's interests." "Town's doing fine," Jack said. "Woman's minding her own business. Seems like everybody's interests are looked after." Mosher's jaw worked for a moment. Then he turned and walked back down the street without another word. Maggie watched him go. Then she looked down at the letter in her hands, still folded, still soft at the creases, and she breathed out slowly through her nose. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know it," Jack said. He didn't leave. That was the thing that surprised her. He stood there at the bottom of the steps with his hands loose at his sides, not pressing, not performing, just present in the particular way some men had of taking up space without demanding anything from it. "You've been out here 3 days," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." Man didn't show. "No." He nodded. Said nothing for a moment. Then, "You got a place to stay." Maggie's chin came up slightly. I've been managing. Ain't what I asked. She looked at him steadily. No, she said finally. I don't have a room. I've been... She stopped. It cost her something to say this next part. I've been sleeping in the back of the livery. The man there, Mr. Cobb, he said I could use the corner stall if I kept quiet about it. Jack was quiet for a moment. Cobb's a decent man, he said. He is. Another silence. The kind that had weight to it, the kind Maggie had learned to read in the years since her mother died, and she'd had to start reading rooms and people fast. I got a ranch, Jack said. 3 miles north. I could use someone to help with the cooking in the house. It's not much, but it's a room with a door and a bed, and I pay fair wages. Maggie stared at him. You don't know me. No, I don't. I could be anyone. You could be, he agreed. You'd take that risk. He looked at her for a long moment. I watched you sit on those steps for 2 days, while half this town whispered ugly things about you, and you didn't move, and you didn't cry, and you didn't beg anybody for anything. He paused. I'm willing to take the risk. Something cracked open inside her chest. Right then, small, the way ice cracks at the very end of winter when the sun finally gets its angle right. She pressed her lips together and looked down at the letter. She thought about Harold Greer, who had written to her about good intentions and had delivered none of them. She thought about the boarding house in St. Joseph, where she'd counted every penny in that glass jar for 4 years. She thought about Dorothy Hicks saying fool or something worse, and she thought about all the women who'd crossed the street. She thought about what she was going to do if she got on that eastbound stage Friday. And then she thought about a door with a lock on it and a bed that wasn't straw. What's your name? She asked. Jack Holt. Maggie Calloway, she said. She stood up. It took more effort than she wanted to show her legs had stiffened in the heat, and she hadn't eaten since the previous morning, but she stood straight, and she kept her face even. I'll want to be paid weekly. I'll want Sundays to myself, and I'll want it understood from the start that this is a work arrangement and nothing else. Jack looked at her. Something moved in his expression, not quite amusement, not quite respect, but the space between those two things. Understood, he said. And I'll want it in writing. Both our names the terms signed. His eyebrows went up slightly. All right. I've learned, Maggie said simply, not to trust arrangements that aren't written down. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he said, That's fair. He reached down and picked up her trunk before she could move toward it. It was a natural gesture, automatic the way men moved who'd been lifting things all their lives without thinking about it. He started walking toward where his horse was hitched to the post. Then he stopped and looked back. You coming? He said. Maggie looked once more at the post office door. At the steps where she'd sat for 3 days in the summer heat watching the whole town decide what she was worth. She folded the letter one more time and put it in her coat pocket. Then she walked down those steps, and she didn't look back. The ride north was mostly quiet. Jack Holt didn't seem to be a man who talked to fill silence, which suited Maggie fine. She sat on the wagon bench beside him with her trunk in the bed behind her, and the summer land rolling out on both sides, dry grass scrub pine. The sky so blue and enormous it felt like a judgment, and she told herself that she was not afraid. She was afraid. But she told herself differently. How long have you had the ranch? She asked about a mile out. 8 years, he said. You run it alone. Got 2 hands, Emmett and Pete. Good men. A pause. Emmett's wife does the cooking most weeks, but she's been poorly this summer. That's how the need came about. Maggie processed this. So this isn't charity. He glanced at her sideways. No, ma'am, it's not. I needed to know that. I figured you did, he said. They went quiet again. The horse moved steadily on the road. A hawk turned in a slow circle overhead riding something invisible. The man who wrote you, Jack said after a while, not looking at her, looking at the road. You know why he didn't come? Maggie felt the question land in the center of her chest. No, she said. I don't. You going to try to find out? She thought about this. She had thought about it constantly for 3 days, whether to go to the land office, whether to ask around town, whether to write a letter back to the agency. She'd turned it over and over the way you turn a stone, looking for what's underneath. No, she said finally. Jack nodded slowly. It doesn't matter why, Maggie said. And she meant it the way you only mean things that cost you something to say. What matters is what I do now. He said nothing for a moment. Then, that's a hard thing to get to. Yes, she said. It is. She looked at her hands in her lap. The letter crinkled in her pocket when the wagon hit a rut. She thought about how she'd believed in Harold Greer, not in him exactly because she'd never met him, but in the idea of him. In the possibility he represented. A door opening. A life that was different from the one she'd been living. She'd believed in the letter the way people believe in things when they're desperate enough. Completely. Without the protection of doubt. And it had cost her. Mr. Holt, she said. Jack, he said. Don't need the mister. Jack. She tried the name. It was a plain name. She liked that about it. I want you to know something before we get there. I'm a hard worker. I don't complain, and I don't make problems, and I don't ask for things that aren't mine to ask for. Whatever arrangement we write down today, I'll honor it. He glanced at her. Just once. I believe you, he said. It was such a simple thing to say. I believe you. 3 words, no performance, no grand gesture. And yet, Maggie had to look away when he said it, because something in her eyes was threatening to do something she would not permit. The ranch came into view just as the sun hit the top of the sky. It was not beautiful in the way that places in novels were beautiful. It was sturdy. It was honest. The main house was weathered wood with a solid porch and windows that had their shutters straight. There was a barn, a garden plot running alongside the south wall of the house, with things growing in it that she couldn't identify from a distance, and a well with a new rope on the crank. 2 men looked up from the fence line as the wagon came in. One of them was thick-built and about 50 with a face like a saddle. The other was younger, maybe 25, with straw-colored hair under his hat. Emmett. Pete, Jack said, pulling up the horse. The older one, Emmett, pulled his hat off and nodded to Maggie. Ma'am? This is Miss Calloway, Jack said. She'll be running the house. You treat her with respect, and you answer her questions straight. Understood? Yes, sir, Pete said quickly. His voice was earnest in the way of young men not yet sure where they stood in the world. Emmett simply nodded with the quiet dignity of someone who'd never needed to be told twice about anything. Jack climbed down and came around to Maggie's side and offered his hand for the step down from the wagon bench. She took it one brief practical contact, his hand dry and rough and impersonal, and stepped down onto the dirt of the yard. She looked at the house. She had been in worse places. She had been in places with no light and no warmth and no privacy and no safety. She knew how to measure a place not by what it was, but by whether it could hold a person. This one could. I'll show you the room, Jack said. Then we'll write up the terms. Thank you, Maggie said. She followed him up the porch steps and through the front door, leaving the burning June afternoon behind her. Inside, she stood in the main room for a moment, while Jack moved toward a hallway in the back. She heard him open a door. She heard him say, "It's small, but it's clean." She reached into her coat pocket. She pulled out the letter. She looked at it for a long moment, at Harold Greer's careful handwriting, at the words, "Good intentions," at the date that now felt like it belonged to a different woman's life. Then she folded it in half, and in half again, and she held it in her fist. She was not going to throw it away. Not yet. She was not the kind of woman who pretended things hadn't happened. But she was also not going to carry it in her pocket anymore, like something she still needed. She was going to put it away. She was going to put it somewhere that wasn't here Wasn't now. Wasn't this room in this house, with this man she didn't know, and all the possible futures she hadn't decided yet. Miss Calloway. Jack's voice from the hallway. Maggie squared her shoulders. Coming, she said. And she walked forward. The room was small. Jack hadn't lied about that. It had a narrow bed with an iron frame, a washstand with a chipped ceramic basin, a single window that looked out toward the south garden, and a hook on the back of the door for hanging clothes. That was everything. No rug, no curtain on the window, no decoration of any kind. Maggie stood in the doorway and looked at it for a moment. I can get a curtain put up, Jack said behind her, if you want one. It's fine, she said. Emmett's wife, Clara, she's been resting at their place on the east side of the property. She'd probably have something spare if... Mr. Holt. Maggie turned around. Jack, it's fine. I've slept in worse rooms than this. She paused. I've slept in worse than a livery stall if we're being honest. This is a good room. I'm grateful for it. He studied her for a moment in that particular way. He had not invasive, not searching, just steady, the way a man looks at something he's trying to understand without taking it apart. All right, he said. I'll get paper for the terms. He left her there. She heard his boots on the floorboards going back toward the main room. She set her trunk at the foot of the bed and sat down on the mattress. Real mattress cotton, ticking not straw, and pressed her hands flat on her thighs and breathed in through her nose and out through her mouth slowly. The way she'd taught herself to breathe in the bad years when the textile factory had been so loud she couldn't hear herself think. She was all right. She was going to be all right. She did not entirely believe this yet. But she was saying it to herself anyway, the way you said things before they were true, because sometimes that was the only way to make them become true. She got up, splashed water on her face from the basin, smoothed her hair back as best she could, and went out to sign her name to the terms of a life she hadn't planned. Jack had written it out by hand at the kitchen table, a plain piece of paper, his handwriting careful and surprisingly even for a man with roughened hands. He pushed it across the table to her when she sat down across from him. She read it word by word. She always read things word by word now. That was another thing the last 4 years had taught her. Miss Margaret Calloway agrees to provide housekeeping, cooking, and domestic management for the Holt Ranch. Payment of $2 per week paid each Friday. Room and board included. Sundays are Miss Calloway's own time. This arrangement may be ended by either party with 1 week's notice. Signed in good faith. Maggie read it twice. Then she looked up. You spelled my name right. I asked you your name, he said simply. I was paying attention. She looked back down at the paper. Something about that single sentence reached into her chest and pulled on something she hadn't expected. Such a small thing. Paying attention. Being paid attention to. She picked up the pen he'd left beside the inkwell. She signed her name. Margaret A. Calloway. The A stood for Anne, after her mother, and she always included it in signatures because her mother had been a woman worth remembering, even if nobody in Harlan Creek knew that. She slid the paper back. He signed it, folded it once, and handed her half. Other half's mine, he said, in case there's ever a question. There won't be, Maggie said. No, he agreed. But it's better with paper. She looked at him. You said that same thing I said. You said it first, he said. You were right. For a moment, neither of them said anything. Then Maggie stood up and said, What needs doing this afternoon? What needed doing was considerable. The kitchen had been running on Emmett's wife Clara's system, and Clara's system made sense to nobody except Clara. Maggie spent the first 2 hours going through every cabinet and shelf and crate, not rearranging anything. Yet she was smarter than that. She knew better than to walk into someone's home and start shifting things around on day one, but understanding the logic of it, or the lack of it, so she knew what she was working with. Pete came in at some point, wanting to know if there was coffee. Maggie looked at him. He was young and earnest, and had the look of someone who'd grown up being told he asked for too much. "There will be," she said. "Give me 20 minutes." He looked startled, like he'd expected to be turned away. "Yes, ma'am." "And don't call me ma'am," she said. "I'm probably not much older than you. Miss Calloway is fine." "Yes, Miss Calloway." He stood there a second too long. "Was there something else?" she asked. "No, ma'am, Miss Calloway. Just—" He shifted his hat in his hands. "It's real good to have someone in the kitchen again. Emmett and me been eating cold biscuits for 2 weeks. Maggie stopped what she was doing and looked at him properly. He meant it. He was not performing, not angling for anything. He was just a young man who'd been eating cold biscuits for 2 weeks and was relieved about it. 20 minutes, she said again, but softer. The coffee was ready in 15. She made it strong the way her mother used to, and when Jack came in from the east field and poured himself a cup and stood at the kitchen window drinking it without saying a single word, she counted that as the first small thing she'd done right. The trouble started on her 4th day. She'd been watching for it, not this trouble specifically, but trouble generally, because trouble always came, and it was better to see it coming than to be surprised by it. In Harlan Creek, the trouble wore a blue dress and came in the form of Dorothy Hicks. Maggie was at the general store picking up salt and coffee beans when Dorothy came in with her friend, a woman named Vera Stubbs, whose husband was on the town council, and both of them saw Maggie at the counter and made the particular kind of noise that women make when they want you to know they're talking about you. "I heard she went out to the Holt place," Dorothy said, not bothering to lower her voice. Vera made a sound. "Alone with a single man." "Apparently so." Dorothy's tone was the specific kind of pious that people used when they were enjoying themselves. Jack Holt ought to know better. She could be anyone. She could be a well. She left the blank open for Vera to fill in, however her imagination wanted. Maggie set her purchases on the counter and turned around. "Good morning, Mrs. Hicks." Dorothy Hicks went still. "I remember you," Maggie said pleasantly. "You were the one who said I was either a fool or something worse, while I was sitting on those steps." She tilted her head slightly. "I've been wondering which one you decided on." Vera Stubbs made a soft sound, her hand going to her collar. Dorothy's face had gone a complicated shade. "I was simply expressing a concern." "About me," Maggie said. "Yes, I know." She kept her voice even, kept her hands easy at her sides. "I'm Margaret Calloway. I'm working for Jack Holt as his housekeeper. The arrangement is in writing, signed by both parties, and it's entirely proper. I thought you might like to know since my situation seems to be of interest to you." She picked up her parcels and walked out the door. Her heart was hammering so hard she could feel it in her ears, but she walked out of that store with her chin level and her spine straight, and she didn't look back, and by the time she got to the wagon, she'd managed to convince herself that her hands weren't shaking. They were shaking. She gripped the reins and breathed, and told herself it didn't matter what Dorothy Hicks thought of her. She told herself that 6 more times on the drive back to the ranch. She didn't tell Jack about it. She wasn't going to. It wasn't his business, and she wasn't in the habit of carrying her trouble to other people's doorsteps. But Emmett found out the way men who'd worked a small community for 20 years always found out everything, and Emmett apparently said something to Jack that evening, because Jack came into the kitchen while she was cleaning up after supper and stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands and said, "I heard you had words with Dorothy Hicks." "It wasn't much," Maggie said, not stopping what she was doing. "It was enough for the whole town to be talking about it by supper time." "I imagine it was." She set the clean pot on the shelf. "Are you troubled by that?" A pause. "No," he said. "Good." She turned around and looked at him. He was still standing in the doorway with his hat, and there was something in his face that she couldn't read which made her careful. "I spoke politely," I didn't make a scene. I simply told her the truth about my situation, so she'd have less to speculate about. I know. You know. Emmett told me word for word, Jack said. And the corner of his mouth moved. Not a full smile. She was beginning to understand he wasn't a man who gave those out freely, but the suggestion of one, the shape of one. He thought it was about the finest thing he'd seen in years. Maggie looked at him for a moment. Then she turned back to the shelf, because she didn't want him to see that she'd almost smiled back. "Good night, Jack," she said. "Night, Miss Calloway." She listened to his boots go back down the hall and out the front door, and then she stood very still in the kitchen for a moment, with her hands flat on the counter and her forehead almost touching the shelf, breathing. He was not Harold Greer. He was not anyone she'd imagined or expected or planned for. He was a man who paid attention when you told him your name, who stood at the base of post office steps and told a bully sheriff to back down, and who came into the kitchen to tell her that Emmett had called her the finest thing he'd seen in years. And that was all it was. She was not going to build anything on the back of those small things. She knew better. She knew exactly how fast small things could vanish. Clara Meadows came to the house on day 6, moving slow and careful, the way people moved when they were recovering from something that had taken more than it was supposed to. She was about 45 with dark eyes and a way of looking at people that made Maggie feel like she was being read cover to cover. She knocked at the front door mid-morning, and when Maggie opened it, she said without preamble, "You're the girl from the post office steps." "I am," Maggie said. "I'm Clara, Emmett's wife. I ran this house for 4 years before my lungs decided to have opinions about it." She paused to breathe. "Can I come in?" Maggie stepped back and let her in. Clara walked through the main room, slowly taking inventory. She didn't comment on anything. She went into the kitchen and sat down at the table without being invited, and Maggie, who recognized a woman who didn't waste time on ceremony, put the kettle on without being asked. "You moved the coffee," Clara said. "I did. I put it closer to the stove. Easier to reach when your hands are full." Clara looked at the new position of the coffee tin. She said. Not approval, not objection, just acknowledgement. Maggie set the tea down and sat across from her. "You read the letter," Clara said. Maggie went still. "I beg your pardon?" "The man who didn't come. Harold Greer." Clara wrapped both hands around the teacup. "I knew the name. Emmett told me who you were waiting for." She looked at Maggie directly. "There was a Harold Greer who had 40 acres east of here about 2 years ago. Drank bad. Gambled worse. Lost the land and moved on." She paused. "I don't know if it's the same man." The kitchen was completely quiet except for the sound of the summer outside. Maggie looked down at the table. She thought about the letter in her trunk. She'd put it at the very bottom under her second dress, and she thought about good intentions and 40 acres and brown hat. "It's the same man," she said. She didn't know that for a fact, but she knew it. The way you knew certain things when the pieces were arranged in a particular shape and your gut had stopped arguing with your brain. "I'm sorry," Clara said. "Don't be." Maggie's voice was steady. "He did me a favor, actually. I didn't know that yet when I was sitting on those steps. But sitting here now in this kitchen." She stopped, started again. "I'm not sorry I came." Clara studied her for a long moment. "Jack hasn't had anyone in this house since his wife left," she said. The sentence landed in the room like a stone in still water. Maggie looked up. 3 years ago, Clara said. Her name was Ellen. She hated this land, hated the quiet, waited until he was out working one morning, and took the wagon to town and got on the stage east. Clara's voice was matter-of-fact, not cruel, just the tone of someone reporting history. He came home to an empty house, and a note that said she wasn't built for this life. He hasn't talked about it once since. Not to Emmett, not to anyone that I know of. Maggie sat very still. "I'm not telling you this to meddle," Clara said. I'm telling you because this house has been cold for 3 years, and you've been here 6 days, and last night Emmett said Jack ate 2 full plates of supper and looked like he'd forgotten something he'd been carrying. The silence stretched. I'm his housekeeper, Maggie said carefully. I know what you are, Clara said. She picked up her teacup. I know what you are right now. She said it without pressure, without coyness, the way women said things to each other when they were past the age of being indirect. I just wanted you to know what he is. That evening, Maggie was pulling weeds from the south garden when Jack came around from the barn and stopped short when he saw her there. You don't have to do that, he said. I know I don't. She kept working. The beans are getting choked. I couldn't leave it. He stood there for a moment. Then he crouched down on the other side of the row and started pulling weeds without another word. They worked in silence for a while. The sun was going down behind them, and the air was finally losing some of its heat, and somewhere beyond the fence line, a bird was making its evening argument with the world. Clara came by today, Maggie said. She felt him go still for just a fraction of a second. Then he kept pulling weeds. I know, Emmett told me. She's a plain-spoken woman. Always has been. Maggie sat back on her heels and looked at the row they'd cleared. You don't have to explain anything to me, she said. About the house, about anything. That's not what I'm here for, and it's not my business. Jack was quiet for a moment. What did she tell you? Enough, Maggie said. He nodded, said nothing, pulled another weed. I'm not going to treat you differently, Maggie said. Because of it. He looked at her then directly fully in the dying evening light. And for the first time since she'd met him, she saw something behind his eyes that wasn't steadiness. It was something older and more complicated and more human than steadiness. It was the look of a man who'd been waiting without knowing he was waiting for someone to say that exact thing. I appreciate that, he said. His voice was quieter than usual. They went back to the weeds. The bird outside the fence kept on with its argument. And Maggie, who had promised herself she was not going to build anything on the back of small things, felt the warm summer air on her face and the dirt under her fingers, and listened to the sound of someone working steadily beside her. She told herself it was nothing. But she stayed until the last of the light was gone, and so did he, and neither one of them said a word about it afterward. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, not from Harold Greer. Maggie had stopped expecting anything from that direction. This letter came addressed to Jack in handwriting that Pete recognized before he even handed it over, because Pete's face did something complicated when he set it on the kitchen table that morning, and said quietly, It's from back east, Jack. Looks like, well, you'll see. Jack picked it up. He looked at the handwriting on the front for a long moment, and his face went the way faces went when something arrived that a person had stopped believing would ever arrive, but had never entirely stopped bracing for. He folded the letter and put it in his shirt pocket without opening it. He went out to the barn. Maggie had been standing at the stove, and she'd seen all of it. She turned back to the eggs she was scrambling and said nothing, because she was not the kind of woman who pried, and she had no standing here, and she knew it. But Pete was still standing in the kitchen doorway, and Pete, for all his good intentions, had not yet learned when to be quiet. It's from Ellen, he said. He looked at Maggie like he needed her to do something with this information. His wife, the woman who left. I know who Ellen is, Maggie said. Right. Pete shifted his hat. It's just he hasn't heard from her in 3 years, not once, not a single word. He paused. You think she's coming back? Maggie set the spoon down very carefully on the side of the pan. She thought about the garden the previous evening, about the bird making its argument, and Jack's hands moving steadily through the dirt beside hers, about the look in his eyes when she'd said, I'm not going to treat you differently. That's not my business, she said. Or yours. Go eat your breakfast. Pete went. But the question he'd left behind him stayed in the kitchen long after he did, sitting at the table like an uninvited guest that nobody had the authority to ask to leave. Jack didn't mention the letter at supper. Maggie didn't ask. The meal was quieter than usual, which was saying something, because meals at the Holt Ranch were never loud to begin with. Emmett ate with his eyes on his plate. Pete kept glancing between Jack and Maggie like he was watching for weather. It was Emmett, finally, who cleared his throat and said, "Storm moving in from the north. Might want to get the south fence checked before it hits." "I'll ride out tomorrow morning," Jack said. "I can go with you," Pete offered. "I'll go alone," Jack said. That was the end of the supper conversation. Maggie washed the dishes alone afterward and listened to the sound of Jack's boots cross the porch and stop and then not move for a long time. She knew he was standing out there. She didn't go out. She gave him the silence because it was clearly what he needed, and she understood the particular kind of silence a person needed when something from the past had reached through a door they thought they'd locked. She'd had her own version of that door. She understood it from the inside. She dried the last dish and went to her room and lay down on the narrow bed with her hands folded on her stomach, staring at the ceiling. And she told herself for the 14th time in 2 weeks that she was not building anything here. She was not reading into anything here. She was a woman who had learned her lesson about trusting the shape of things before she knew what was inside them. She believed herself a little less each time she said it. The next morning, Maggie walked into town for supplies. She did it partly because the pantry needed restocking, and partly because she needed to breathe air that wasn't thick with other people's unresolved history. She hitched the smaller wagon herself the way Emmett had shown her, and she drove the 3 miles into Harlan Creek with the morning sun on her left shoulder and her mind doing the work it always did when her hands were occupied, turning things over, examining them, putting them back down. She was halfway through her list at Henderson's General Store when she heard the voice. She didn't know it was his voice. She'd never heard his voice. She'd only ever had his handwriting, his careful sentences, his good intentions. But something about the way the man at the end of the counter said, "I said," put it on credit. "Henderson, I'm good for it," made the hair on her arm stand up. She turned around slowly. He was about 40, heavy in the way that men got heavy when they'd been drinking consistently for years, not fat but soft, like something that had once been solid and was now losing its edges. His clothes were dusty in a different way from ranch dusty. Road dusty. The kind of dust that accumulated when a person had been moving from place to place for a while and hadn't stopped long enough to wash anything. His hat was brown. Maggie's heart stopped. Then it started again, twice as fast. Henderson was saying something about the credit already being stretched, and the man Harold Greer, it had to be Harold Greer. She knew it with the same certainty she'd known it about Clara's story. Harold Greer was leaning on the counter with one elbow and arguing in the tone of a man who was used to arguing and not used to winning. She should have left. She knew she should have left. She had 3 more items on her list, and she could come back tomorrow for them. She could walk out the door right now and get back in her wagon and drive back to the ranch and never say a single word about this to anyone. She didn't leave. "Harold Greer," she said. Her voice came out level. She was proud of that. The man turned around. He looked at her with the unfocused attention of someone who hadn't slept well in days. Then something moved across his face. Recognition maybe, or the shadow of it. Guilt, definitely. She could see guilt from a considerable distance. She'd spent enough of her life on the receiving end of it. "Lord," he said. Barely a whisper. "That's not my name," Maggie said. Henderson had gone very still behind his counter. Greer straightened up slowly like a man trying to remember how to hold himself upright. "Miss, I reckon you must be Margaret Calloway," she said it clearly. "I came on the stage from Missouri on the 14th of June. I sat on the steps of the post office for 3 days, waiting for a man in a brown hat." She looked at the hat. "Your hat. Miss Calloway." He said her name like it cost him something. "I can explain." "You don't have to," she said. And she meant it, which surprised her. "I don't need your explanation. I needed it 3 weeks ago when I was sitting on those steps with one trunk and no money, and this whole town deciding what kind of woman I was. I don't need it now." Greer's face had gone gray. "I lost the land," he said anyway, like he couldn't help himself. "The 40 acres there was a debt I thought I could fix it before." He stopped. Tried again. "By the time the stage date came, I had nothing left to offer a woman. No house, no land, nothing. I thought it was kinder not to." "Kinder," Maggie said. He flinched. "I know how it sounds." "Do you?" She took one step toward him. She was not loud. She was not going to be loud in Henderson's general store and give this town one more thing to say about her. But she was not going to be small about this either. "You left me stranded in a strange town with no money, no room, and no name. People said things about me on those steps that I will not repeat in public. The sheriff tried to put me on the next stage out." She held his gaze. "You did not write. You did not send word. You did not send the agency a single line. You simply didn't come." Greer's eyes had gone wet at the corners. "I know it," he said. "I know it, and I'm sorry. And there ain't a thing I can do to make it right." "No," she said. "There isn't." The silence in the store was absolute. Maggie turned back to the counter, picked up her purchases, and put her money down in front of Henderson, who took it with the expression of a man who had just witnessed something he would be talking about for 30 years. She picked up her parcels. She walked out the door. She got 3 steps down the boardwalk before her knees went soft, and she had to stop and put one hand on the post and breathe. Just breathe. In and out slow, the way she'd practiced, the way she'd taught herself in the factory, with the noise and the heat and the endless hours of repetition. She was all right. She was all right. She had just looked the ghost of the last 4 years in the face, and she was still standing. She was all right. She didn't tell Jack about Greer that evening either. But the next morning, when she came into the kitchen and found Jack sitting at the table with the unopened letter from Ellen sitting in front of him. He'd taken it out of his pocket, set it down, and not opened it, just stared at it, the way you stared at something you weren't ready to touch. She set a cup of coffee in front of him and sat down across the table and said, "I saw Harold Greer in town yesterday." Jack looked up. "He was at Henderson's," she said. "He'd lost the land before he was supposed to come for me. He said he thought it was kinder not to show up." She wrapped both hands around her own cup. He was wrong about that. Jack was quiet for a moment. "You all right?" "Yes." She paused. "I was angry. I said some of what I needed to say. Then I left." She looked at the table. "It was strange. I thought seeing him would, I don't know what I thought. That it would answer something. Make something make sense." She shook her head slightly. "It just made it real. It wasn't a mystery anymore. It was just a man who failed and didn't have the courage to say so." Jack's eyes moved to the letter on the table, then back to her. He didn't say anything. "Are you going to open it?" Maggie asked. A long pause. "I don't know yet." "You've had it 2 days." "I know how long I've had it." She nodded, started to get up. His voice stopped her. "She wants to come back," he said. Maggie went still. "I haven't opened it," he said. But Emmett ran into the postmaster. Pruitt told him Ellen's been writing to people in town, asking about the ranch. He said it flatly, the way men said things when they were trying to excise the feeling from them. "Apparently she's had a difficult time of it back east. Her sister she went to live with, it didn't go how she planned." Maggie sat back down slowly. She looked at him. "Jack." "I know," he said. "That's not what I was going to say." He looked up. "I was going to say that's your decision to make. Not anyone else's. Not mine." She held his gaze. "I just want you to know that whatever you decide, I'm not going anywhere until you tell me to." She paused. "I have a signed agreement. I intend to honor it." Something shifted in his face. something quick and complicated and gone before she could read it clearly. "Is that the only reason?" he said. The question landed between them and sat there. Maggie looked at him for a moment. She felt the weight of the answer. She actually had the answer that had been building in her since the second evening in the garden, since the coffee she'd made in 15 minutes, that he'd drunk without saying a word since every morning she'd come into the kitchen and he'd already been up and the stove was warm because he'd started it for her without being asked or acknowledged. "No," she said. "It's not the only reason." She got up and went to the stove before either one of them could say anything else. He opened the letter that afternoon. Maggie didn't see him open it. She was in the garden doing the weeding she'd made a habit of in the evenings. But she heard the porch door open and close, and she heard the silence that followed, the specific quality of silence that meant someone was alone with something they'd been dreading, and she kept her hands in the dirt and let him have it. 20 minutes later, the porch door opened again. Maggie. He'd never called her just Maggie before. It was always Miss Calloway, with the steadiness of a man keeping his own rules. She turned around and looked at him on the porch, the opened letter in his hand, and she felt the whole shift of the moment in her chest before he said a single word. "She's not coming back," he said. She waited. "She wrote to say she's getting remarried. A man in Philadelphia." He looked at the letter, not at Maggie. "She wanted me to know before I heard it another way." A pause. She also wrote that she was sorry for how she left. She said, he stopped, read from the letter quietly. "I know I left you badly, and I know the house went cold because of it, and I want you to know I'm sorry for that, Jack, even if I wasn't wrong about needing to go." He folded it. That's all. Maggie stood in the garden and looked at him on the porch, and she saw something she hadn't expected to see on a man who had held himself as steady as bedrock for every day of the 3 weeks she'd known him. He looked relieved. Not happy. Not devastated. Just relieved. Like a man who'd been waiting for a storm that finally hit and passed and left the air clean. "Jack," she said. He looked at her. "Come help me with the beans," she said. "They're winning." He looked at her for another moment. Then he set the letter on the porch railing and walked down the steps and came into the garden and crouched down beside the bean row without a word. And they worked side by side in the late afternoon light. And neither one of them said anything about Ellen or Harold Greer, or the letters, or the last 3 weeks. And somehow the silence between them was different now, lighter, like something had been taken out of it that had been sitting too heavy for too long. They were halfway down the row when Pete came running from the direction of the barn. Both of them looked up. Pete was not the running type. Pete's natural pace was the unhurried, deliberate movement of a young man who'd been told not to panic about things. When Pete ran, something was wrong. "Jack." He was breathing hard when he reached the garden fence. "There's a man at the gate. Says he's from the land office in Cheyenne." Jack straightened slowly. "What does he want?" Pete's eyes moved to Maggie, then back to Jack. "He's got papers. Says there's a lien on the South 40, back taxes, and a disputed boundary line." He swallowed. "He says if it ain't settled in 30 days, the county can move to seize." The air in the garden changed. Maggie looked at Jack. His jaw had gone tight, not panicked, but hard the way it went when he was calculating something under pressure. He stared at Pete for a moment. Then he pulled off his garden gloves and said, "Where is he?" "Tied up at the gate. I told him to wait." Jack looked at Maggie. Something passed across his face, not a request exactly, but not an order either. Something in between. Something that said, I might need someone who knows how to read a document to be in that conversation. Maggie pulled off her own gloves. "Let's go," she said. They walked toward the gate together, and the late sun threw their shadows out long behind them across the dry summer grass, and the man from the land office was still on his horse when they reached the fence. holding a rolled document in one hand with the blank professional courtesy of someone who delivered bad news for a living and had learned not to look too directly at the people receiving it. "Mr. Holt," the man said. "That's me," Jack said. "My name is Caldwell, Thomas Caldwell from the Cheyenne Land Office." He held out the document. "I'm afraid I have some papers requiring your attention." Jack took the roll. He started to open it. Maggie put her hand out, and he stopped. He looked at her. She said quietly, "May I?" He handed it to her. She unrolled it and read it the way she read everything word by word all the way through twice. When she got to the second page, something cold moved through her. She kept her face even. She kept reading. "What does it say?" Jack asked. Maggie looked at Caldwell on his horse. "Who filed the lien?" she asked. Caldwell's professional courtesy tightened slightly. "The filing party's information is in the—" "I see the filing party's information," Maggie said. "I'm asking you to confirm it." She held up the second page and pointed to a name on the document. "Is this man the one who initiated this action?" Caldwell looked at the name. "That's correct." Maggie lowered the paper. "Jack," she said. Her voice was level. "Careful. The way voices got when the thing you were saying was too important to risk being misunderstood. Do you know a man named Martin Greer?" Jack stared at her. "Martin Greer. Harold Greer's brother." "Yes." She held up the paper. "He filed this lien 6 weeks ago, before I ever arrived in Harlan Creek." The silence stretched out across the yard. Jack looked at Caldwell, then back at the paper, then at Maggie, with an expression that was moving through several things rapidly: confusion, calculation, and something that was sharpening toward anger. "The South 40, he said slowly. "That was the parcel I bought from a man named Henry Beale 7 years ago. Beale said the boundary line was clean." "According to this," Maggie said, "Martin Greer is claiming his family held prior rights to a 12-acre strip of that parcel before Beale ever sold it." She looked at the document again. "But the filing date is wrong." She pointed. "He filed this claim after the territory changed the statute of limitations on disputed land rights last year. If Beale's original deed is clean, this lien shouldn't hold. But if it gets in front of the wrong judge before you can test it—" "The county can move against the ranch," Jack said. "Yes," Maggie said. Caldwell cleared his throat. "Mr. Holt, I'm simply delivering the paperwork. The filing party has 30 days from today to—" "I understand the timeline," Jack said. He looked at Maggie. His jaw was tight, but his eyes were steady with the particular steadiness of a man who had decided that panic was not a choice available to him. "You read land documents before—" "I read everything," Maggie said, "and I know when something doesn't add up." He held her gaze for a moment. "We need Beale's original deed." "We need it today," she said, "not tomorrow." He turned back to Caldwell. "Tell whoever's listening that the deed will be in front of a territorial judge inside 2 weeks. And tell Martin Greer—" He stopped. "No, don't tell him anything." Caldwell touched his hat, wheeled his horse, and rode back toward the road. Jack and Maggie stood at the gate with the document between them and the full weight of everything it represented settling over them like weather. She was looking at the papers. He was looking at her. "How did you know to check the filing date?" he asked. "Because in my experience," Maggie said, "when someone comes for what belongs to you with a piece of paper and a legal argument, the paper is usually the problem." She looked up at him. "Harold Greer lost his 40 acres to a debt. Martin Greer is his brother. You've had this ranch for 8 years. That is not a coincidence." Jack's eyes narrowed. "You think this is connected to Harold. I think Martin Greer watched his brother lose his land and went looking for someone else's to take." She folded the document carefully. "I think he picked yours because you're out here working it alone, and he thought you wouldn't know what you were reading when the papers arrived." She held the document out to him. He took it. But he didn't look at the papers. He looked at her. At this woman who'd been sitting on post office steps 3 weeks ago with a worn trunk, and a letter from a man who never came, who'd walked into his kitchen and reorganized the coffee tin and made Pete feel heard, and faced down Dorothy Hicks without raising her voice, and sat beside him in the garden in the dark, and pulled weeds like she'd been doing it her whole life. "Maggie," he said. "We should find that deed tonight," she said. "Before anything else." "Yeah," he said. "We should." He didn't move immediately. "Thank you." She met his eyes. "We have a signed agreement," she said. "I told you I'd honor it." "That's not what I mean," Jack said. She knew it wasn't. She looked at him for one steady moment. "I know," she said. Then she turned and walked back toward the house to find the deed. And he followed her, and behind them, the summer evening came on quietly indifferent to all of it, the way Wyoming evenings always were. They found the deed in the third place they looked. Jack had 2 wooden boxes under the floorboard beneath his bed, the kind of storage that men who didn't trust banks developed over years of working land they were afraid to lose. The first box had old letters, a photograph and a surveyor's map from 1866 that was no longer accurate. The second box had what they needed. Maggie spread the deed on the kitchen table under the lamp and read it 3 times, while Jack stood across from her with his arms folded, and Emmett sat at the end of the table saying nothing, which was what Emmett did when situations were serious. "Henry Beale's signature is clean," Maggie said. "Witnessed and dated March 1867. The boundary line is described exactly, and it includes the South 40 in full." She set her finger on a specific line of text. "Martin Greer's claim is that his family held prior rights to a 12-acre strip within this parcel. But this deed was filed and recorded in the territory before the Greer family ever registered anything in this county." "So the lien doesn't hold," Jack said. "Not if this deed is clean and the recording date is verified." She looked up. "But here's the problem. Someone has to go to Cheyenne with this document and file a formal contest before the 30 days are up. And whoever goes needs to know what they're contesting and why, because a land office clerk is not going to sort this out for you." Emmett's chair scraped back slightly. He was looking at Maggie with an expression she'd started to recognize the look he had when he was revising an opinion he'd formed earlier. "You know how to do that," he said. "File a contest." "I know how to read a legal document," Maggie said. "I know what an invalid filing looks like. I know enough to explain the problem to a territorial judge if it comes to that." She paused. "My father was a land surveyor in Missouri before he died. I used to copy his correspondence when I was 12 years old. Some things stay with you." Jack was watching her. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said, and he almost smiled. "When can we leave?" "Tomorrow morning," she said. "Early." Emmett pushed back from the table and stood up. "I'll have Pete ready the wagon before first light." He paused in the doorway. "Miss Calloway?" She looked up. "I'm glad Jack found you on those steps," he said. Then he walked out before she could respond. The kitchen was quiet. The lamp threw soft light across the deed on the table. Maggie looked down at it and smoothed the corner with her thumb. "You didn't tell me your father was a surveyor," Jack said. "You didn't ask." "Fair enough." He was quiet for a moment. "You've been carrying a lot of knowledge for a woman who came off a stage with 1 trunk." "I came off a stage with 1 trunk," she said. "I didn't say it was an empty one." This time he did smile. Brief real, the kind that changed his whole face for just a second before it went away. Maggie looked back down at the deed and told herself very firmly that she had not been waiting 3 weeks to see that. She absolutely had been waiting 3 weeks to see that. They left before sunrise. The road to Cheyenne was long, and the summer heat built quickly once the sun got up. Jack drove. Maggie sat beside him with the deed and the lien document in a leather satchel on her lap, and went over what she was going to say when they reached the land office, organizing her arguments the way her father had taught her. Lead with the facts. Follow with the law. Leave the emotion entirely out of it, because emotion in a legal office was the fastest way to be dismissed. About an hour out, Jack said, "Tell me about your father." She looked at him. It was an unexpected question from a man who rarely asked unexpected questions. "He died when I was 16, she said. "Fever. It took him in about 10 days. She kept her voice even. "After that, it was just me and my sister Catherine. She married at 19. I went to the factory." She paused. "The surveying work he used to let me come with him on short jobs when I was small. He said a woman who could read a land document would never be entirely helpless." She looked at the satchel in her lap. "He was right about that at least." "Smart man," Jack said. "He was." She was quiet for a moment. "He would have told me not to trust an arrangement that wasn't witnessed in person. He would have told me to meet a man before I agreed to marry him." She looked out at the road. "I knew that. I just ran out of patience with my own life somewhere around year 3 of the factory." She said it without self-pity, just the plain fact of it. Desperation makes you simplify the math. Jack said nothing for a moment. Then, "I married Ellen because she was the only woman I'd met who said she wanted this life. The land, the ranch, the quiet." He kept his eyes on the road. "She meant it when she said it. I believe that. I think the idea of it was true for her, and then the actual living of it turned out to be different from the idea." He paused. "I should have paid closer attention to which one she was in love with." Maggie turned that over. "You're not angry at her." "I was," he said, "for a long time. Now I'm mostly," he considered the word, "tired of it." She understood that, the exact weight of that specific tiredness. "Being tired of being angry," she said, "is sometimes the only way you stop." He glanced at her. "Yeah," he said. "That's exactly what it is." They went quiet after that. But it was the kind of quiet that had things in it now, things said and understood, and set down carefully between two people who had both learned to be cautious with words because words had cost them. Maggie watched the road and held the satchel steady on her lap and thought about her father and about the factory and about Harold Greer's handwriting and about how the path that had brought her to this wagon on this road to this particular mission was the most unlikely sequence of events she could have imagined sitting in her room in St. Joseph 2 months ago. And yet here she was, moving forward, doing something useful, beside someone who listened when she talked. She thought her father would have liked that. Thomas Caldwell was not at the Cheyenne land office when they arrived. The clerk behind the counter was a young man named Mills, who had the harried look of someone managing more work than he'd been hired for. He looked at the documents Maggie set on his counter with the expression of a man who'd processed so many filings that individual ones had stopped meaning anything. "We're here to file a contest on this lien," Maggie said. She put the deed alongside the lien document. The lien was filed by a Martin Greer of Harlan Creek against the Holt Ranch. The boundary claim is invalid. Here's the original deed properly witnessed and filed in the territorial record predating any Greer family claim to the parcel in question. Mills looked at both documents. His eyebrows rose slightly. "You've reviewed these yourself." "I have." "Are you a legal representative?" "I'm the person who read both documents carefully," Maggie said, "and identified the problem. I'd suggest the territorial recorder do the same before Mr. Greer's claim gets in front of a judge who doesn't have time to notice that the filing date doesn't add up." Mills looked at Jack. Jack said nothing and gestured back at Maggie, which Mills seemed to find unusual and Maggie found satisfying in a way she didn't examine too closely. "I'll need to pull the original recording records," Mills said. "Please," Maggie said. "We'll wait." They waited for 45 minutes. Maggie sat on the bench along the wall and organized her thoughts. Jack sat beside her, hat in his hands, patient in the way he was patient about everything, not passively but actively. Like patience was a deliberate choice he made fresh every few minutes. "If they find the recording matches," Jack said quietly, "does the lien get dismissed?" "It should be flagged for review at minimum," Maggie said. The judge will have to formally dismiss it, but if the territorial record shows what this deed shows, Greer's claim has no legal standing. She paused. The question is, who filed it and why, and whether Greer actually believed he had a claim, or whether he knew he didn't. You think he knew? I think a man who watches his brother lose 40 acres to bad decisions and then targets a neighboring rancher with a paperwork claim 6 weeks before his brother's mail-order bride is due to arrive. She stopped. I think that is not a coincidence, and I think that is not ignorance. Jack turned his hat in his hands. You think Harold told him about the arrangement? About me? Harold Greer came to Harlan Creek ahead of me, Maggie said. He was there in that town at some point. He knew you had the ranch. He knew the South 40. She looked at Jack. I think Harold's brother decided that a single rancher distracted by a new woman and a failing arrangement was a good target for a land grab. Silence. That's a cold thing, Jack said. Yes, Maggie said. It is. Mills came back before either of them could say anything more. He was carrying a bound ledger and looked for the first time like the documents in front of him had his genuine attention. The original deed for the Holt parcel was recorded March 14, 1867, he said. Henry Beale grantor, John Holt grantee, witnessed. He looked up. The Greer family's first recorded claim in this county is dated 1871. He closed the ledger. That's 4 years after the Holt deed. Then the lien has no basis, Maggie said. Mills looked at both of them. I'll flag this for the territorial recorder. There'll need to be a formal review, but... He paused. Honestly, ma'am, I don't know how this got through initial filing. Someone should have caught this at the Harlan Creek level before it ever came to us. That, Maggie said, is an excellent question. They didn't speak much on the first hour of the drive back. Maggie was thinking about what Mills had said. Someone should have caught this at the Harlan Creek level. Land office filings didn't happen in a vacuum. Someone in Harlan Creek had accepted Martin Greer's filing, processed it, and sent it forward. That someone either hadn't done their job or had done someone else's job instead. Sheriff Mosher, she said. Jack looked at her. Who handles land filing disputes at the county level in Harlan Creek? She asked. Goes through the sheriff's office first, Jack said slowly. Mosher signs off before anything moves to Cheyenne. Maggie thought about Mosher on the post office steps, thumbs in his belt, the particular way he'd move toward her, not with curiosity, but with the practiced efficiency of a man who wanted her gone before she saw something. Does Mosher know the Greer family? She asked. Jack's jaw tightened. Martin Greer's been in Harlan Creek 2 years. He's on the town council. He stopped. He and Mosher drink together on Friday nights. I know that because Pete mentioned it once, and I didn't think anything of it. Jack, Maggie said carefully. The lien was filed 6 weeks ago. That's the same time I would have been writing to the agency finalizing my travel arrangements. She held his gaze. Harold Greer told his brother he'd written for a woman. Martin Greer filed the lien, and then Harold didn't show up. If I'd left on that Friday stage the way Mosher wanted me to, if I hadn't been sitting on those steps when you came by. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Jack stared at the road ahead. There'd have been nobody at the ranch who could read those papers, he said. I'd have gotten the lien, not understood the filing date problem, and had 30 days to figure out what was wrong on my own. And 30 days is not a lot of time, Maggie said, when you don't know what you're looking for. The silence between them now had a different quality. Not heavy, but charged. The kind of silence that came after two people had followed a thread all the way to what it was attached to. I need to talk to someone, Jack said. Someone with authority above Mosher. The territorial marshal? Maggie said. Yes. He flicked the reins slightly. I know a man. Frank Delaney. He's out of Laramie. We worked a cattle dispute together 5 years ago. He's honest. "Write to him tonight," Maggie said. "Don't go through the Harlan Creek office. Go straight to Laramie." Jack nodded. He was quiet for another moment. Then he said, "Maggie." "Don't," she said. He looked at her. "Don't thank me again," she said. "I can't keep receiving it gracefully, and I'd rather not embarrass myself." A pause. Then from Jack Holt, who was not a man who laughed easily, a short, low, completely genuine laugh. It lasted maybe 3 seconds. It changed the whole temperature of the wagon. Maggie looked out at the road and pressed her lips together and felt something warm move through her chest that she was absolutely not going to name out loud. They got back to the ranch as the sun was going down. Pete was waiting at the gate, which meant something had happened while they were gone. Pete didn't wait at gates for pleasant reasons. "What is it?" Jack said before he'd even climbed down. "Martin Greer came by," Pete said. He was trying to keep his voice steady and not entirely succeeding. "About 2 hours ago, him and 2 other men. Said he was just checking on the property line question. He walked the fence on the south side." Pete's jaw tightened. He acted like it was already his. Jack went very still. "Did he touch anything?" Maggie asked. "No, ma'am. I stood on the fence line the whole time. Emmett came out with the rifle and leaned on the post." Pete almost smiled. "He left pretty quick after that." "Good man," Jack said. He looked at Emmett, who had appeared from the barn doorway. "Emmett." "I know," Emmett said. "We keep eyes on that south fence until this is settled." "I'll write to Delaney tonight," Jack said. "Tomorrow I want someone on that fence at all times. Rotate with Pete." "Understood." Emmett looked at Maggie. "How'd it go in Cheyenne?" "The filing date is wrong," Maggie said. "The territorial recorder is reviewing it. Greer has no legal standing on that parcel." Emmett nodded slowly. "So he knows his time is short." "Which is why he came today," Maggie said. "He's pushing before the review comes back." Jack looked at the south fence line in the fading light. Something had settled in him. She could see it in the set of his shoulders. He was not afraid. He was resolved, which was a different thing entirely. "Go eat," he told Pete and Emmett. "I'll be in after I write the letter." They went. Maggie started toward the house. His voice stopped her. "Stay a minute," he said. She turned around. He was looking at the south fence, not at her. "You know what the worst part of the last 3 years has been," he said. "Not Ellen leaving. Not running this place alone." He paused. "Not having anyone to think through a problem with. Anyone who'd look at the same thing I was looking at and see what I wasn't seeing." She stood still. "I've been alone in my own head for a long time," he said. He turned and looked at her. The last of the evening light was on his face, and his eyes were that creekwater color, and he was not performing anything, not managing anything, he was just standing there telling her the truth. "And then you showed up on my porch, and you read the deed, and you asked the right question about the filing date, and you figured out Mosher before I even got there, and I—" He stopped. "I don't know how to say this without it sounding like more than you're ready to hear." Maggie's heart was beating very carefully. "Say it anyway," she said. "I don't want you to leave," he said. "Not because of the house, not because of the cooking, not because of any arrangement we wrote on paper." He held her gaze. "Because of this, because of what it feels like to think next to you." The evening was completely quiet around them. Maggie looked at this man, this stubborn, steady, plain-spoken man who'd picked up her trunk without being asked, and laughed for 3 seconds in a wagon and put paper in a drawer for both of them, and walked into a garden every evening because she was in it. She thought about the letter in her trunk under her second dress. She thought about good intentions and what they were worth. Then she thought about what intentions looked like when they showed up every single day without announcement and just did the work. "I'm not leaving," she said. He looked at her, waiting. "I'm not leaving," she said again, steadier. "I was going to stay for the agreement. And then I was going to stay because the beans needed weeding. And then I was going to stay because there was a lien to fight. She paused. I'm running out of reasons that have nothing to do with you. Something in his face opened just briefly, just enough. He took one step toward her. He reached out and took her hand, not urgently, not dramatically, the way he did everything with patience and deliberateness, and the full weight of meaning behind the simplest gesture. He held it. That was all. He just held her hand in both of his, there in the last light of that summer evening, and neither one of them moved. Somewhere beyond the fence, the night birds were starting. The ranch was settling into its evening sounds, and Maggie stood in the yard of a place she hadn't planned to be, beside a man she hadn't planned to meet, and felt for the first time in 4 years that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. She didn't say that. It was too much, and they were both too careful, and there was still a land dispute, and a corrupt sheriff, and a letter to Laramie that needed writing tonight. But she didn't let go of his hand either, and neither did he. Later, after Jack had gone inside to write to Frank Delaney, Maggie sat on the porch steps alone for a few minutes. The air had finally cooled. The sky above the Wyoming flats was enormous and full of stars, and indifferent to all human complications the way skies always were. She reached into her coat pocket out of habit, then stopped. The letter wasn't there anymore. She'd moved it to the trunk. She'd meant to put it somewhere she wasn't carrying it, and she had, and tonight for the first time she'd reached for it without thinking, and it hadn't been there, and she hadn't felt the absence of it the way she'd expected. She'd felt something closer to relief. She thought about Harold Greer in Henderson's store, soft at the edges and sorry in the way of men who were too late. She thought about good intentions that never showed up. She thought about paper signed in good faith and the strange, unpredictable paths that paper could lead you down. She thought about a hand holding hers in the last of the evening light. Inside the house, she heard the scratch of Jack's pen moving across paper. She got up, went inside, and started the kettle for coffee, because it was going to be a long night and the letter to Laramie needed to be right, and she had thoughts about what it should say. She was, after all, a woman who paid attention to words. Frank Delaney's reply came in 9 days. Maggie was the one who saw Pete ride in with it, because she'd been watching for it, the way she'd been watching for everything since the night she and Jack sat at the kitchen table and wrote the letter together. She suggesting the precise legal language, he writing it out in his careful hand, both of them going over it twice before he sealed it. She brought the letter to Jack in the barn without opening it, because it was his ranch and his name on the deed, and his fight, even if it had become hers too, in ways she was still measuring. He opened it standing in the barn doorway with the morning light on his face and read it once fast, then again slower. His expression didn't change much. It never changed much. But she'd been living in the same house as this man for over a month now, and she knew the difference between his stillness and his tension, and what was on his face right now was neither. It was something that looked like it might be vindication, which was a different thing from relief and a much more dangerous thing to feel before it was finished. "Delaney's coming," he said. "He'll be here in 4 days." He looked up from the letter. "He says the Greer claim isn't the first time a contested filing has come through Harlan Creek without proper review." He paused. "He's been watching Mosher for 8 months." Maggie went still. 8 months. Before any of this started. Jack folded the letter. "He says there have been 3 other filings in the last 2 years that looked clean on the surface and weren't. 2 of them settled before anyone looked closely. One rancher took the county's offer and sold out at half the land's value." He looked at Maggie. "Delaney thinks Mosher and Greer have been running this as a pattern. Find isolated properties, create paper doubt about the title, push the owner to settle fast or lose everything." The barn was very quiet. "That rancher who sold out at half value," Maggie said. "Do you know who it was? Name in the letter is Beaumont. Had a spread south of town. Did he leave the area? Delaney says he moved his family to Colorado." Maggie pressed her lips together. She thought about a man packing up his family and going because a piece of paper had told him his land wasn't his, and he didn't know how to fight back. She thought about how close Jack had come to the same thing. She thought about Mosher on the post office steps, thumbs in his belt, moving toward her with the practiced efficiency of a man who wanted her gone. "He tried to put me on that stage," she said, not for the first time, but saying it now with the full weight of what it meant. "I know," Jack said. "If I'd gone, I know Maggie." She looked at him. "When Delaney gets here, I want to be in that conversation." "You will be," Jack said without hesitation, without qualification, the way he said things, when the answer was obvious to him and always had been. The 4 days before Delaney arrived were the most careful days Maggie had spent on the ranch. Martin Greer came by twice more each time with the same thin pretense of checking the property line, each time leaving faster than he came, when Emmett materialized from somewhere with his particular brand of silent immovability. The second time Greer brought a man Maggie didn't recognize, younger, with the look of someone hired for his size rather than his judgment. "He's testing us," Emmett said that evening at supper, "seeing if we'll flinch." "We won't," Pete said with the conviction of youth. "No," Jack agreed. "We won't." Maggie said nothing. She was thinking about Greer's face the second time he'd come, the tightness around his eyes, the way he'd glanced toward the house before he'd turned his horse. He was nervous. The territorial recorder's review would have reached him by now. He knew his timeline was collapsing. Nervous men made mistakes. She'd learned that at the factory, watching foremen who knew they'd underpaid the wrong woman or cut the wrong corner. Nervous men pushed harder right before they fell apart entirely. She went to her room that night and sat on the edge of the narrow bed, that small, honest room that had started to feel more like hers than any place she'd lived in years, and she thought about what a nervous Martin Greer might do in the next 4 days before a territorial marshal arrived in Harlan Creek. She thought about it for a long time before she slept. On the second day, Harold Greer came to the ranch. Not Martin. Harold. In a wagon by himself, no hired size, no pretense about property lines. He came up the road in the mid-afternoon and stopped at the gate and called out for the house. And it was Maggie who heard him from the kitchen, because Jack and Emmett were out on the south fence and Pete was in the upper field. She came to the porch and looked at him. He looked worse than he had in Henderson's store. The road dust was still on him, and there were shadows under his eyes, and he was holding his hat in his hands with the grip of a man who'd practiced the gesture he was about to make and still wasn't sure it would work. "Miss Calloway," he said. "Mr. Greer," she said. "I'd like to speak with Mr. Holt." "He's not here right now." Greer's jaw worked. He looked down at his hat. "Then maybe I could speak with you." He looked up. "Please." She studied him for a moment. Every instinct she had said to send him away. He had caused her harm, genuine harm, the kind that didn't heal in a month or settle out cleanly. She owed him nothing, not a minute of her time, not a word of her attention. But she was also a woman who believed that information mattered more than satisfaction. And Harold Greer, standing at the gate with shadows under his eyes and his hat in his hands, looked like a man who had something to say that she needed to hear. "Wait there," she said. She came down off the porch and crossed the yard and stopped at the fence, 8 feet between them, and folded her arms and looked at him steadily. "Say what you came to say," she said. Harold Greer swallowed. "My brother Martin," he started. "He told me what he was doing. He told me last week after the territorial office sent him the review notice." He stopped, tried again. "I didn't know. I want you to understand that. When I wrote to the agency, when I wrote to you, Martin didn't know about it. I didn't tell him until after I'd lost the land." He pressed his lips together. "When I told him I'd written for a woman, and she was coming to Harlan Creek, he said he had a plan. He said he'd been watching Holt's spread for months. He said having a mail-order woman arrive and then not show up would be a distraction." Harold's voice dropped. "I didn't ask him what he meant by a plan. I didn't ask enough questions, and I am standing here because I didn't, and I know that doesn't fix anything." Maggie looked at him for a long moment. "He knew I'd sit on those steps," she said. "He knew Mosher would try to move me on." "I think so," Harold said. "Yes. And if I'd left, Jack Holt would have been alone when those papers arrived." Harold said nothing, which was the same as saying yes. The anger was there. It had never really gone. She'd just kept it below the level where it interfered with what needed doing. But she looked at Harold Greer and saw a man who had come here voluntarily, without being sent for, to tell her something that would not benefit him in any way, and might in fact cost him considerable family loyalty. And she understood that this was the closest thing to courage she was going to get from him. It wasn't enough, but it was what it was. "There's a territorial marshal coming in 2 days," she said. "Frank Delaney out of Laramie. He's going to want a full account of your brother's actions and Mosher's involvement." She held Harold's gaze. "If you want to do one right thing in all of this, Mr. Greer, you'll go to Harlan Creek, and you'll be available to give that account when he asks for it." Harold nodded, slow, heavy. "I'll do that," he said. "Good." She unfolded her arms. "Don't come to this ranch again." She turned and walked back to the house. She made it to the kitchen before her hands started shaking. Not from fear, not from anger, but from the effort of holding everything steady for so long. She put both hands flat on the table and breathed and let the shaking run its course, and when it was done, she put the kettle on and sat down and stared at the surface of the table until the water boiled. She heard Jack's boots on the porch 20 minutes later. He came in and looked at her face and said, "What happened?" She told him all of it word for word. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. "You handled that alone. You weren't here." "I know." He looked at her. "You all right?" "Yes," she said, and she meant it more than she had the first dozen times she'd said it in the last month. "I'm fine." He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, just for a moment. Then he sat back. "2 more days," he said. "2 more days." She agreed. Chapter. Frank Delaney rode into Harlan Creek on a Thursday morning, and Maggie knew within 5 minutes of meeting him that he was exactly the kind of man a corrupt small-town sheriff feared most. Quiet, thorough, and entirely unimpressed by local authority. He was 50, with a gray mustache, and the eyes of someone who'd spent 20 years sorting truth from performance, and had gotten very efficient at it. He shook Jack's hand, and then turned to Maggie and said, "You're the one who caught the filing date." "I read the document," Maggie said. "Mills at the territorial office said you came in and laid it out cleaner than half the lawyers he deals with." Delaney's tone was not flattery, it was simple reportage. "I'd like you in the room when I talk to Mosher." Jack looked at Mosher's office across the street. The sheriff was visible through the window, watching them with the stillness of a man who knew exactly what was coming and had run out of ways to stop it. "Let's go," Delaney said. What followed was the most precise and controlled 45 minutes Maggie had ever witnessed. Delaney sat across from Mosher with a stack of documents, not just the Greer lien, but the other 2 contested filings Delaney had pulled from the territorial record, and a series of letters between Martin Greer and the sheriff's office that Delaney's office had subpoenaed from the Cheyenne mail records, and he went through them one at a time, placing each on the desk between them, asking Mosher to confirm or deny each item with the patience of a man who already knew every answer. Mosher denied everything for about 20 minutes. Then Delaney put down the letter. It was a letter from Mosher to Martin Greer dated 3 months ago, discussing the Holt property by name and the specific language of the lien before the lien had been publicly filed, before it had been filed at all. The room went completely silent. Mosher looked at the letter. His face went through several things in rapid succession. Then it settled into the gray flatness of a man who had been calculating exits and found all of them closed. "I want to speak to a lawyer," Mosher said. "That's your right. Delaney said. He picked the letter back up. "Badge stays on the desk, Dale." Mosher looked at Jack. Something moved in his face. Not remorse, not quite, but the pale shadow of it. The thing that came when a man was caught rather than when he was genuinely sorry. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," he said. "No," Jack said. "You meant for it to go exactly far enough that I lost 40 acres, and you and Greer split whatever you made on the deal, and I couldn't prove a thing." He said it without heat, which was somehow worse than heat. "You just didn't count on her." He didn't look at Maggie when he said it. He didn't need to. She felt it. Mosher unpinned his badge and set it on the desk. Martin Greer was taken into custody by Delaney's deputy that same afternoon. Harold Greer, as promised, gave his account to Delaney in full at the land office. The territorial recorder formally dismissed the lien on the Holt South 40 before sundown. The Beaumont family in Colorado was contacted. The case of their forced sale would take longer months probably, and a territorial court proceeding, but Delaney said he was confident. The town of Harlan Creek, which had whispered about Maggie on post office steps and sent Dorothy Hicks to deliver judgment and watched a crooked sheriff try to run an honest woman off, received all of this news in the particular silence of communities that had looked away at the wrong moment and knew it. Clara said when she heard the full accounting that evening at supper. "Well, I hope Dorothy Hicks chokes on her own opinion." Emmett said Clara. "I mean it kindly," Clara said, and clearly didn't. Pete said nothing because his mouth was full, but he was grinning, which said enough. Jack looked at Maggie across the table and said nothing at all. But his eyes held the same thing they'd held at the gate 4 days ago, and in the garden before that, and in the wagon on the road to Cheyenne, that steady, patient, deliberate warmth that he didn't perform and didn't announce, and simply was the way the land was, the way the ranch was, something that had been here all along, waiting to be recognized. 3 days after Delaney rode back to Laramie, Maggie went to her room in the early evening and got the letter from the bottom of her trunk. She hadn't touched it since the night she'd reached for it out of habit and found it wasn't in her pocket anymore. She'd left it where it was and let the days go by. Now she held it in both hands and read it one more time. All the way through. Harold Greer's careful handwriting, and his 40 acres, and his brown hat, and his good intentions. Every word she'd memorized in Missouri. Every word she'd carried on the stage, and on the steps, and through every hard thing that had happened in between. Then she folded it, took it to the kitchen stove, and dropped it in. She watched it catch. The paper curled at the edges, first the way paper did. Then the words disappeared. Then there was nothing but a small bright flame, and then ash, and then nothing at all. She felt the weight of 4 years go with it. Not bitterly, not triumphantly, just gone. The way things went when you were finally ready to let them. She heard his boots in the hallway. Jack came into the kitchen and stopped when he saw her standing at the stove. He looked at her face, then at the stove, then back at her face. He didn't ask. He already understood. "Come outside," he said. "I want to show you something." She followed him out to the south garden. The summer evening was doing what Wyoming summer evenings did, going slow and golden and enormous, the sky turning colors that didn't have names yet. He led her to the edge of the garden and stopped. Along the south fence line, where last week there had been bare dirt, there was a row of young plants, small, just pushing up, still fragile looking in the way of things that were going to be very strong eventually. Maggie looked at them. "Sunflowers," she said. "Pete ordered the seeds from the general store," Jack said. "I told him what I wanted and where." He paused. "They'll be tall by September. They'll face the house." She looked at him. "I planted them on the south side," he said. "Because that's the side you look out from your room." Maggie stood very still. She felt something in her chest that was too big to name and too important to minimize. And she was not going to cry in the south garden of a Wyoming ranch in front of a man who had never once asked her to be smaller or quieter or less than exactly what she was. She was going to say something instead. "Jack," she said. "I know it's been 2 months," he said. "I know you came here on a signed agreement, and you've honored it beyond anything I had a right to expect." He looked at the sunflowers, then at her. "I'm asking you to tear it up." She waited. "Not because the work isn't worth paying for," he said, "but because I don't want you here because of paper." He turned to face her fully the way he did everything directly, without performance, with his whole self behind it. "I want you here because you want to be. I want you to be. I want to ask you." He stopped. He was not a man who stumbled over words. The fact that he was stumbling now meant something. "Maggie, I would like you to stay as my wife, if that's something you could want. Not for the house, not for any arrangement. Because you're the steadiest thing that's happened to me in 3 years, and I don't know what the South Garden looks like without you in it anymore." The summer evening was quiet around them. Maggie looked at the sunflowers. She thought about the girl who had counted pennies in a glass jar for 4 years in St. Joseph and believed so hard in the idea of a door opening. She thought about 3 days on post office steps and a trunk that wasn't empty, and a letter that was now ash in a kitchen stove. She thought about coffee in 15 minutes, and a signed piece of paper with both their names on it, and weeds pulled in the dark, and a hand held at a gate in the last of the light, and the 3 seconds of a real laugh in a wagon on a Cheyenne road. She thought about what it felt like to be paid attention to have someone say I was paying attention, and mean it in every single thing they did, every single day, without asking for credit. She looked at Jack Holt, who was standing in his south garden, with his hat in his hands, and sunflowers at his back, waiting for her answer, the same way he waited for everything, without rushing her, without flinching, with the full quiet confidence of a man who had decided what he wanted and was prepared to hear whatever she needed to say. "Yes," she said. He exhaled, just once, just barely. Then he reached out and took her hand. "That's the only word I needed," he said. "I know," she said. "I've been watching you collect small words for 2 months. I thought it was time I gave you a big one." He looked at her for a moment. That almost smile, the real one, the 3-second one. "You're going to keep doing that, aren't you? Saying things that make you almost smile?" "Yeah." "Probably," she said. "You're going to have to get used to it." "I think I can manage," he said. Clara came around from the east side of the house at that exact moment, saw them standing at the south fence, holding hands in the last of the evening light, stopped, looked at Emmett, who had appeared behind her, and said nothing. She just put her hand over her mouth and turned back toward the house. Emmett tipped his hat at Jack, then at Maggie. Then he followed Clara without a word, which was the most eloquent thing Emmett had done in their entire acquaintance. Pete cried at the breakfast table the next morning when Jack told the two of them. He denied it. He said he had something in his eye. He had it in his eye for approximately 45 seconds. "Pete," Maggie said, "I'm fine." He said, "Not fine." "I know," she said, and went back to the eggs. Delaney sent word from Laramie a week later that the territorial court had ruled Martin Greer's lien fraudulent and referred the case for criminal prosecution. Mosher was formally removed from office. A man named Briggs was appointed interim sheriff, a quiet man who Emmett reported had no known associates with land interests and appeared to have no opinions about women sitting on post office steps. Dorothy Hicks crossed the street the following Saturday when she saw Maggie coming out of Henderson's general store. Maggie watched her do it, thought about the steps and the whispers and fool or something worse, and then thought about the south garden and the sunflowers and the words she'd said in the last of the evening light, and she found to her own mild surprise that Dorothy Hicks crossing the street was exactly as significant as the dust behind a wagon after it had already gone. Nothing. Less than nothing. She had somewhere to be. By September, the sunflowers were tall. They were taller than Maggie, which she had not entirely anticipated when Jack planted them. And they did face the house exactly as he'd said they would, a full row of them along the south fence, gold and certain and ridiculous in their exuberance, like something that had decided to be joyful and committed to it completely. She looked at them from her window every morning. Her window now in a different sense than it had been in June. Her room, her house, her garden, her south fence. Her stubborn and steady and plain-spoken husband, who had come into the kitchen before sunrise every single morning for 2 months, and started the stove without being asked or thanked, and never mentioned it once. She thought about the woman who had stepped off a stage in June with one trunk and a worn letter, and the specific desperation of someone who had simplified the math too far. She thought about 3 days on those steps, the heat, the whispers, the sheriff's thumbs in his belt. She thought about the moment she'd said, "I ain't leaving," and meant it without knowing yet what staying was going to mean. She looked at the sunflowers, and at the ranch that was hers now as much as his, and at the man crossing the yard below her window, who had not yet seen her watching, but who in about 30 seconds would look up the way he always looked up, with the unhurried certainty of someone who already knew where to find what he was looking for. He looked up. She raised her hand. He tipped his hat. She turned from the window to go start the coffee, and behind her, the September sun came full over the Wyoming flats and hit the sunflowers, and the whole south fence line blazed gold. And Margaret Ann Calloway Holt, who had come to Harlan Creek on a broken promise and found something no letter had ever been able to name, walked forward into the bright and ordinary morning of her own life, and she did not look back.